right, so we're back and ready to dive into more of Frankenstein. This time we're looking at chapters 4 through 6.
Yeah, these chapters are really where things start to heat up, you know?
For sure. We see Victor totally consumed by his studies.
Oh, yeah, he's like obsessed.
Totally. And then, bam, he makes his groundbreaking discovery. But maybe not in the way he expected.
Yeah, it's a bit of a Pandora's box situation.
It is. And then, of course, we get the creation of the creature. And Victor's reaction, well, let's just say he's not exactly winning any Father of the Year awards.
He kind of freaks out, to put it mildly.
Right. I mean, this whole section just sets the stage for everything that comes next, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. It's like all these big themes, ambition, the dangers of messing with nature, this whole creator versus creation thing, it all starts here.
Okay, so let's talk about Victor's ambition. Because his drive to uncover the secret of life, it's bordering on obsession, right?
Totally. I mean, Shelley really drives this home with how she describes his dedication to his study. He's completely isolated, like he shut himself off from the world. The stars often disappeared in the light of morning while he was still working away.
Yeah, the dude's like a machine. No sleep, no social life, just science, science, science.
Exactly. And that brings us to this whole idea of like forbidden knowledge. Victor's clearly crossed a line, right? Stepped into territory maybe humans weren't meant to enter.
Right. And it makes you wonder, is there always a price to pay for this kind of ambition? You know, for reaching too far.
Well, I think that's the question Shelley's asking, right? Victor's all excited at first, but when he actually sees what he's made, pure horror.
It's like the reality of what he's done hits him like a ton of bricks. The weight of his actions.
Yeah, and it totally changes him. Goes from feeling like a god to being completely disgusted by his creation.
That shift is fascinating, right? I mean, what do you make of that sudden change in Victor?
I think it shows this, like, duality in human nature. On one hand, Victor's this brilliant guy, capable of amazing things, but he's also deeply flawed, driven by fear and ego as much as intellect, and that internal conflict, ambition versus fear, creation versus destruction, it's like the core of his character.
So it's not just a simple good versus evil situation. Victor's way more complicated than that.
Exactly, and that's what makes him so interesting, right? You see him wrestling with these impulses, trying to reconcile his noble goals with this, well, horrifying reality.
And speaking of horrifying, let's talk about the creature. Shelley doesn't hold back when describing him. She paints this really vivid picture of, well, something kind of monstrous.
Yeah, there's this deliberate contrast she uses. On one hand, you have these, like, almost beautiful features, lustrous black hair, pearly white teeth.
Right, right.
And then on the other hand, it's all yellow skin and shriveled complexion. Like, Shelley's messing with our ideas of beauty and ugliness.
She's definitely making us confront something unsettling about this creature, for sure. But here's the thing. Despite his appearance, his initial actions aren't monstrous, are they? He seems confused, even scared. Reaching out to Victor almost like he wants reassurance.
That's such an important point. The creature isn't born evil. He's innocent, wants connection, just like anyone else. But Victor's reaction, the fear, the disgust, that immediately sets him on a different path.
It makes you wonder if things could have been different, right? Like, what if Victor had reacted with compassion instead of running away? Maybe the creature's fate was sealed from the moment he was abandoned.
Possibly, and that leads into another big theme here, isolation. Victor's so focused on his work, he completely isolates himself from everyone, family, friends, the whole world.
Yeah, and that isolation ends up warping his perspective, leading him to make, well, some pretty bad choices. And then you have the creature whose isolation is even more profound. Abandoned at birth, rejected by everyone because of how he looks.
It's a recipe for disaster, right? That feeling of rejection shakes him, fuels his resentment and anger, ultimately sets him on this dark path. So we've got these huge themes, ambition, the duality of human nature, isolation, all swirling around in these chapters. It's clear that Frankenstein is so much more than just a monster story.
It really makes you think about what it means to be human, right? The choices we make and the responsibility we have for our actions.
Exactly. And the way Shelley uses language, it just amplifies everything. The imagery, the Gothic setting, these stark contrasts, it all creates this feeling of uneasiness, like something's not quite right.
It's like she's pulling us into this dark and unsettling world, making us confront our own fears.
Exactly. And as we go deeper into the story, we'll see how she keeps using language to create this truly unforgettable experience, one that sticks with you long after you finish the book.
And that's what makes Frankenstein a classic, right? It's not just about a monster, it's about the monsters we create in ourselves, the consequences we face. But for now, let's take a closer look at these two characters, Victor and his creation. We've touched on their motivations, how they're developing.
We'll dive into their relationship, their journeys, the choices they make that lead to, well, tragedy. Stick with us because it's about to get even more intense. So, we talked about Victor, his ambition, and Niñas, and all that fear. But would you notice how his pursuit of knowledge, it's not just scientific for him, it's almost spiritual, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it's like he's trying to understand the meaning of life itself, unlocking these huge secrets of creation. And when he does, it's not just a scientific win, it becomes this massive existential crisis for him.
Exactly. Remember how he describes feeling after he makes the creature? Breathless horror and disgust filling his heart. Like he's violated something sacred, like he shouldn't have gone there.
It's like the weight of what he's done hits him, but instead of facing it, he runs, abandons his creation, and just retreats into denial.
And that avoidance, that inability to face his actions, that's what kicks off this whole tragedy. It's like classic hubris, overreaching and then completely failing to deal with what comes after.
Playing God without any of the responsibility.
Right, and then there's the creature, whose story is just as tragic, thrown into the world alone, abandoned, seen as a monster by everyone.
It's rough.
Imagine being born, fully aware, and everyone is just horrified by you.
It would be devastating. But even with all that, he's resilient. He learns to read, watches people, even develops this sense of morality. Helping the DeLacy family, chopping wood, bringing them food.
Yeah, that's a big moment. It shows he's not inherently bad. He could be kind, empathetic, but it's constantly stifled, by the rejection and isolation.
It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Everyone treats him like a monster, so he becomes one. Which brings us back to that duality of human nature thing. Both Victor and the creature, good and evil, creation and destruction, all mixed up.
Like two sides of the same coin. And the real tragedy is they don't see their shared humanity, that potential for connection, for understanding.
And Shelley really brings that out with her language. How she describes the creature's emotions, his longing for acceptance, the anger at being left alone.
Yeah, there's that part where he talks about his feelings. My heart yearned to be known and loved by these amiable creatures. It's just raw need for connection. And when he realizes his appearance makes that impossible, despair turns to rage.
And that rage, it comes from Victor rejecting him. The one person who should have loved him unconditionally just turns away. That's got to be what drives him to revenge.
Totally. The creature's violence, it's a direct result of the violence done to him, physical and emotional. This cycle of pain and payback that consumes them both.
And Shelley doesn't shy away from the fallout. She uses these super vivid images, powerful metaphors, for the horror that comes from Victor's actions.
Remember that scene with the creature in fire? He's mesmerized by it at first, warm and bright. But then he burns himself, and it's this realization of its destructive power.
Wow, yeah?
It's like a metaphor for his journey. He could be good, but the pain and rejection twist him into something dangerous.
It's like watching a train wreck. You know it's coming, but you can't stop it. And Shelley uses foreshadowing, too. Hints at the tragedy from the very start.
Oh, absolutely. Victor's dreams, his anxieties, that whole ominous mood, it all builds to this dark, inevitable ending.
Like Shelley saying that choices have consequences. And sometimes those consequences are huge and destructive.
And it's not just Victor who suffers. His family, his friends, even total strangers, they all get pulled into this web of tragedy.
It's scary how our actions affect others, often in ways we don't intend.
Right? It shows how connected we all are. But before we get into those wider consequences, let's talk about Shelley's writing for a minute. The imagery, the symbolism, it's just captivating.
It's not just telling the story, it's making you feel it. Dark and stormy nights, empty landscapes, the way she describes the creature, it's all this atmosphere of horror and dread, and it stays with you.
And it's not just the visuals, it's the emotions, too. Like when she describes Victor's descent into madness, phrases like, my brain burned with an intense fire, or my heart palpitated in the sickness of fear.
It's so intense, you feel his anxiety and paranoia building.
Exactly. Her writing's so visceral, so raw, that it pulls you right in. You feel their pain, their fear, everything. It's what makes Frankenstein a masterpiece. It speaks to our deepest fears, which are still relevant today.
Yeah, totally.
As we move into the last part of our deep dive, we'll look closer at those anxieties, Victor's actions, the creature's revenge, and how this story impacts our understanding of ourselves and the world. Stay with us, because it only gets more intense from here.
So we talked about Victor, his downfall, the creature's whole tragic journey. But one thing that really struck me in these chapters is how much the creature learns. He becomes so self-aware. Like, he starts as this abandoned, confused being, and then he's reading, observing people, analyzing them.
Yeah, it's incredible. He's like this sponge soaking up knowledge from everywhere. Remember how he talks about learning to read, finding those discarded books? He
Right.
says, I learned to distinguish my letters one from another. Like that drive to learn, to understand the world. It's powerful.
And it's not just like basic stuff. He's reading Plutarch, Milton, these deep philosophical works about human nature. It makes you wonder, what's going on in his head? How's he processing all this with his experiences?
That's what makes him so compelling, right? He's not just a monster. He's this thinking, feeling being, trying to figure out who he is, where he fits, and the way he observes the DeLacy family. So insightful. He sees their kindness, their love, and it just awakens this longing in him for connection, for belonging.
It's heartbreaking, though, because he sees that beauty in human relationships, the warmth, but he knows he can never have it, not with how he looks.
And that's where the resentment towards Victor comes in. He sees his creator as the source of his misery. The one who made him this way condemned him to this life alone. Remember when he cries out, I am thy creature, I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed.
Ugh, that line gets me every time. So much pain in it. He feels robbed of love, of acceptance. And it feels like that betrayal is what pushes him to revenge.
Oh, absolutely. His actions, as awful as they are, come directly from that pain Victor caused. This vicious cycle, violence and retribution. And it could have been broken if Victor had just shown him a little compassion.
Which brings us back to responsibility, right? Shelley's making a huge point about the consequences of our actions, especially with creating something, anything. Victor, in his arrogance, doesn't think about the ethics of what he's doing, just creates life without considering the responsibility that comes with it.
And that has consequences for everyone, not just him. Family, friends, people he doesn't even know, they're all victims of his ambition, his inability to own what he did.
It's like a warning, isn't it, that our choices have these ripple effects. And sometimes those ripples turn into tsunamis.
Definitely, but there's also this glimmer of hope in the creature's story. Like, even when he's at his worst, he shows compassion, moments of humanity.
You're right, like when he mourns William's death, even though he killed him, you see the guilt, the remorse. It's more than just a monster.
Exactly. And then, in the end, he chooses to end his own life rather than keep causing pain. It's tragic, but there's a kind of nobility in that. He breaks free from that hatred and revenge.
It shows that even in the darkest situations, there's always a chance for change, a chance to choose a different path.
Yeah, and that's what makes Frankenstein so powerful. It makes us look at these ugly truths about ourselves. The potential for good and evil in all of us, the consequences of what we do, the responsibility we have.
It's a story that stays with you, makes you question everything, challenge your own biases, and the themes are so relevant, even now.
Absolutely. So as you keep reading Frankenstein, keep asking those questions. Think about the choices Victor and the creature made. And think about what their story means for your life, your choices, your place in the world.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Frankenstein. We hope you'll keep exploring, keep thinking critically, and keep finding those timeless truths hidden in this amazing book. Until next time, happy reading.